Hey, Carson Bible Church, it's Wednesday evening, and it's time for our prayer meeting devotional time. This evening we are in Psalm 9. I'll go ahead and read the text. It says, I will give thanks to the Lord with my whole heart. I will recount all of your wonderful deeds. I will be glad and exult in you. I will sing praise to your name, O Most High. When my enemies turn back, they stumble and perish before your presence. For you have maintained my just cause. You have sat on the throne, giving righteous judgment. You have rebuked the nations. You have made the wicked perish. You have blotted out their name forever and ever. The enemy came to an end in everlasting ruins. Their cities you rooted out. The very memory of them has perished. But the Lord sits enthroned forever. He has established his throne for justice, and he judges the world with righteousness. He judges the peoples with uprightness. The Lord is a stronghold for the oppressed, a stronghold in times of trouble. And those who know your name put their trust in you. For you, O Lord, have not forsaken those who seek you. Sing praises to the Lord, who sits enthroned in Zion. Tell among the peoples his deeds. He who avenges blood is mindful of them. He does not forget the cry of the afflicted. Be gracious to me, O Lord. See my affliction from those who hate me. O you who lift me up from the gates of death, that I may recount all your praises, that in the gates of the daughter of Zion I may rejoice in your salvation. The nations have sunk in the pit that they made, in the net that they hid, their own foot has been caught. The Lord has made himself known, he has executed judgment. The wicked are snared in the work of their own hands. The wicked shall return to Sheol, all the nations that forget God. For the needy shall not always be forgotten, and the hope of the poor shall not perish forever. Arise, O Lord, let not man prevail, let the nations be judged before you. Put them in fear, O Lord, let the nations know that they are but men. Well, I think this is a really interesting and important psalm. This is a psalm of David, and really this psalm is a call to personal worship, a life of worship and praise of God. The first half really is spoken about individual worship, and the second half really is spoken of corporate worship, and in this case being the nation of Israel. In the first half, David is thankful to God. He worships and he praises God because of his intervention on David's behalf. David, as king of Israel, certainly would have been tempted to aggrandize his own name and his achievements, to bring worship and praise to himself. But here it's really everything is directed to God. And he is worshiping and praising God for how God has acted and worked on his behalf to put his enemies under his feet. The nations that continually harassed God's people throughout history, how God has turned them back, and God has preserved David and his position as king of Israel. Then the second half of the psalm really turns to calling the nation of Israel to worship God. Again, for God's intervention on their behalf. Everything here is focused on these things as being God's work. God is the one who is honored and glorified and revered and praised for these events that he has worked out on behalf of David as king and Israel as his people. The second half of this psalm really characterizes God as the rescuer of his people, characterizes God as the refuge of his people, and characterizes God as the ruler of his people. The emphasis is that David here kind of is recounting God's previous intervention on their behalf, but he still acknowledges that there are nations that continue to oppress the afflicted, that continue to turn away from the needs of the poor and the needy, and continue to afflict God's people. And that is true even today. And so David here is recalling God's past intervention, his past deeds for his people, and even in the midst of still suffering oppression and affliction, as God's people, they can look forward to the truth that God will one day again intervene on their behalf. that God will never forsake his Old Testament covenant people, Israel, and as much as God will never forsake his new covenant people, the church. If you find yourself watching the news or hearing of current events, and you find yourself tempted to despair or hopelessness, it's important here with David that we recall all of the ways that God has acted on behalf of his people historically, and that we trust in the promise that God will continue to be the refuge for his people, the rescuer of his people, and the ruler over his people, that God will one day again intervene on behalf of his people. I think it's interesting here that in this psalm, the line between David's throne and God's throne is somewhat blurry, and that really is the hope and promise that we have as we see in Jesus being born of the Davidic line, being the Jewish Messiah, is that Jesus really is the one who sits on David's throne forever. Jesus one day will return to establish his rule over the nations, and Jesus is certainly the refuge for God's people. So we do look forward one day to Jesus returning to rescue his people, to establish his rule over all the nations, to bring his enemies to judgment, and ultimately to put them under his feet. I hope you find encouragement there. Trust in God's promises. Live a life of worship and praise to God because of the things that he's done in the past, and because of the assurance that we know he will one day again act on behalf of his people and intervene for their good and for their rescue. God himself is our refuge, God himself is our rescuer, and God himself is our ruler. Have a good evening. We'll see you soon. God bless you.